Sarah Martinez adjusted her backpack straps as she walked through the dimly lit parking garage beneath the downtown shopping center. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows between the concrete pillars. She had just finished her weekly grocery run, something that felt almost luxurious after spending months in remote military bases where fresh vegetables were a rare treat. At 28, Sarah looked like any other young woman navigating city life. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore comfortable jeans and a plain gray sweatshirt. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had spent the last 6 years as a Navy SEAL. One of only a handful of women to complete the grueling training program and serve in active combat operations. The shopping bags in her hands contained the makings of a quiet evening at home. After her recent deployment ended 3 weeks ago, Sarah was still adjusting to civilian rhythms. The constant alertness that had kept her alive in hostile territories didn't simply switch off because she was now walking through a suburban shopping center instead of patrolling dangerous streets in foreign countries. As she approached her modest sedan, Sarah noticed 3 men loitering near a black SUV 2 rows over. Something about their positioning set off alarm bells in her mind. They weren't casually waiting or having a conversation. Instead, they were strategically placed with clear sight lines of the garage entrance and exit. Their body language was tense, focused. The tallest of the 3, a man with sleeve tattoos and a shaved head, kept glancing at his phone while scanning the area. His companions, one wearing a baseball cap pulled low and another in a hoodie, maintained positions that would allow them to move quickly in different directions. Sarah had seen similar formations during military operations. Though this crude version lacked the precision of trained soldiers, she continued walking at a steady pace, her training automatically cataloging details. The license plate of their vehicle, the makes and models of nearby cars that could provide cover, the location of security cameras, and the quickest routes to exits. Her grocery bags felt light in her hands, but she was acutely aware of how they could limit her mobility if needed. The parking garage was nearly empty at this hour. Most shoppers had finished their errands earlier in the evening, leaving behind a scattering of vehicles belonging to late workers, and a few people like Sarah who preferred shopping when crowds were thinner. The isolation that she normally appreciated now felt different with the presence of the 3 men who were clearly waiting for something or someone. Sarah reached her car and set her bags down to fish for her keys. In her peripheral vision, she saw the 3 men straighten slightly, their attention focusing more intently in her direction. The one with the baseball cap said something to the others, though she couldn't make out the words over the ambient noise of the garage's ventilation system. Her keys found the lock, and she opened the trunk to load her groceries. The mundane action felt surreal given the tension she sensed building around her. During her military service, Sarah had learned to trust her instincts completely. Right now, those instincts were telling her that the evening was about to take a dangerous turn. As she placed the last bag in her trunk, Sarah heard footsteps approaching from behind. Not the casual stride of someone heading to their own vehicle, but the deliberate pace of people with a purpose. She had 2 choices: pretend she hadn't noticed and potentially be caught off guard, or acknowledge the threat and prepare accordingly. Sarah chose preparation. She quietly shifted her stance, distributing her weight evenly on both feet while keeping her hands free. Her car key was positioned between her fingers, not as a weapon but as a tool she could use to slash if necessary. The muscle memory from countless hours of combat training activated automatically, her body preparing for conflict even as her mind hoped it wouldn't be necessary. The footsteps grew closer, and she could hear the soft scrape of shoes against concrete. Multiple sets of feet, moving with coordination but not quite in sync. These weren't random muggers acting on impulse. They had watched her, chosen their moment, and were now executing what they clearly believed would be an easy robbery. "Excuse me, miss." The voice came from directly behind her, close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke on the speaker's breath. Sarah turned slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. The 3 men had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around her, with her car blocking any retreat in that direction. The tall man with tattoos stood in the center, his hands visible but positioned to move quickly. His companions flanked him on either side, their postures aggressive but trying to appear casual. "Yeah?" Sarah responded, her voice steady and neutral. She made brief eye contact with each man, assessing their positions and likely capabilities. None of them appeared to be carrying visible weapons, but that didn't mean they were unarmed. The hoodie and loose clothing could easily conceal knives or other dangerous items. "Seems like you might need some help with your car," the tattooed man continued, his tone carrying a false friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. "These old models can be tricky. Keys get stuck sometimes." It was a transparent pretext. But Sarah played along while her mind calculated options. The parking garage had security cameras, but help could be minutes away, even if someone was monitoring the feeds. The nearest exit was 30 yards behind the men, while the stairwell to the upper levels was closer but would trap her in a confined space with her attackers. "Car's working fine, thanks," she replied, keeping her response short and non-confrontational, while subtly shifting her position to create better angles for movement. The man in the baseball cap stepped slightly closer. "Thing is, we're thinking maybe you could help us out instead. See, we're having some financial difficulties, and you look like someone who might be understanding about that kind of situation." The pretense was dropping away now, their intentions becoming clear. Sarah recognized the pattern from police reports and military briefings about criminal behavior. They were building up to their demand, trying to establish psychological control before making their move. What they didn't realize was that their target had spent years training for situations far more dangerous than anything they could imagine. "I understand perfectly," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm even as her body prepared for action. "But I think there might be some confusion about who's going to help whom tonight." The three men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such a composed response. Most victims would be showing fear by now, either complying immediately or becoming agitated in a way that would make them easier to control. Sarah's steady demeanor was disrupting their usual script. "Look, lady, we're trying to be nice about this," the tattooed leader said, his voice hardening. "Just empty your purse, leave your keys, and walk away. Nobody needs to get hurt here." Sarah almost smiled at the irony. During her last deployment, she had neutralized armed insurgents, survived IED explosions, and completed missions that had been classified at the highest levels. The idea that 3 amateur criminals in a parking garage posed a serious threat was almost amusing, if it weren't for the fact that their attempted robbery was about to ruin their own evening in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. "You're right," Sarah said, taking a small step forward that brought her into optimal striking range. "Nobody needs to get hurt. But I'm afraid that's not really up to me anymore." The tension in the parking garage thickened as the 3 men processed Sarah's unexpected response. The tattooed leader's eyes narrowed, his false friendliness evaporating completely. He had expected fear, submission, or perhaps desperate pleading. Instead, he faced a woman who seemed almost relaxed, despite being outnumbered 3-1 in an isolated location. "I don't think you understand the situation here," he growled, taking a step closer. "This isn't some movie where the pretty girl fights back and wins. This is real life. And real life doesn't care about your attitude." Sarah remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled and even. During SEAL training, she had learned that the moments before combat were often more important than the fight itself. Positioning, timing, and psychological preparation could determine the outcome before the first blow was struck. Right now, she was using those crucial seconds to finalize her strategy. The man in the hoodie began moving to her left, clearly intending to flank her, while his partner with the baseball cap mirrored the movement on her right. It was a basic tactical approach, designed to overwhelm their target from multiple angles simultaneously. Unfortunately for them, Sarah had faced similar situations against opponents far more skilled and dangerous than 3 parking garage criminals. "Last chance," the leader continued, pulling something from his jacket pocket. The metallic glint revealed a switchblade, its blade extending with a soft click that echoed off the concrete walls. "Purse, keys, and any cash you've got. Make this easy on everyone." Sarah's expression didn't change, but internally she shifted into a different mindset entirely. The appearance of the knife had transformed this from a simple robbery attempt into a situation involving a deadly weapon. Her rules of engagement had just changed completely, and not in favor of her attackers. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made all three men pause unconsciously. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm a United States Navy SEAL, and I've spent the last 6 years in active combat operations. I've been trained to neutralize armed threats, and I've done it successfully in places where the stakes were much higher than your grocery money." The three men exchanged uncertain glances. The claim seemed impossible. The woman in front of them looked ordinary, unthreatening. But something about the way she spoke, the absolute confidence in her voice, planted seeds of doubt in their minds. "Yeah, right," the leader scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "And I'm a Marine Corps general. Stop wasting time with stupid stories and give us what we want." "I'm not telling you this to scare you," Sarah continued, taking another small step that improved her positioning relative to all three attackers. "I'm telling you because what happens next depends entirely on your choices. You can walk away right now, and this ends here. Or you can continue with this robbery attempt, and I'll respond according to my training." The man with the baseball cap laughed nervously. "She's bluffing. Look at her. She's just some suburban housewife trying to sound tough. There's 3 of us, and 1 of her." But the leader was studying Sarah more carefully now, noting details he had initially missed. Her stance wasn't that of a frightened civilian. Her hands weren't shaking. Most tellingly, her eyes showed no fear whatsoever, only a calm assessment that suggested she was already several moves ahead in a game they didn't even realize they were playing. "Prove it," he said suddenly. "If you're really some kind of soldier, prove it." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "I'd rather not. Proof would involve demonstrating techniques designed to disable or kill armed opponents. Since you're still holding that knife, any demonstration would likely result in you requiring medical attention." The casual way she discussed violence as a practical matter sent a chill through the garage. This wasn't the bravado of someone trying to talk their way out of trouble. It was the matter-of-fact tone of a professional discussing their area of expertise. "She's crazy," the hoodie man muttered, but his earlier confidence was wavering. "This is taking too long. Let's just grab her stuff and go." The leader made his decision, lunging forward with the knife extended towards Sarah's midsection. It was a clumsy attack, telegraphed and poorly executed. Sarah had faced trained soldiers with combat knives, insurgents with explosive devices, and enemy fighters who had spent their entire lives in warfare. This parking garage mugger might as well have announced his intentions with a written invitation. Sarah moved with fluid precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Her left hand deflected the knife thrust, while simultaneously stepping inside the attacker's reach. Her right elbow connected with his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs and causing him to double over. Before he could recover, her knee rose to meet his descending face, the impact producing a wet cracking sound that echoed through the garage. The entire sequence lasted less than 2 seconds. The leader collapsed backward, the knife clattering across the concrete as his hands reflexively went to his broken nose. Blood began streaming between his fingers as he struggled to breathe through the pain and shock. His 2 companions stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The woman they had intended to rob had just neutralized their leader with movements so fast and efficient that they seemed choreographed. This wasn't random luck or desperate flailing. This was the work of someone who had been trained to fight and kill. "Your friend will be fine," Sarah said calmly, not even breathing heavily from the brief encounter. "Broken nose, possibly a mild concussion, but nothing permanent. He'll have an interesting story to tell when he explains to people how he got those injuries." The man in the baseball cap took a shaky step backward. "We don't want any more trouble. We'll just leave." "That would be wise," Sarah agreed. "But first, you're going to help your friend to his feet and make sure he gets medical attention. A broken nose can cause complications if it's not properly treated." The 2 remaining attackers moved quickly to help their injured leader, their earlier aggression replaced by urgent concern for their own safety. The tattooed man was semi-conscious, mumbling incoherently through his damaged nose while his companions struggled to support his weight. As they began moving toward their vehicle, Sarah called after them. "One more thing. The security cameras in this garage have recorded everything that happened here tonight. If any of you decide to report this incident to police, I'll be happy to provide my military identification and service record. I think you'll find that judges and juries tend to be very sympathetic to veterans who defend themselves against armed robbers. The threat was clear and effective. Even if they had wanted revenge, pursuing it through legal channels would only result in their own prosecution for attempted armed robbery. They were trapped by the very crime they had attempted to commit. Sarah watched as they loaded their injured friend into the SUV and drove away, their taillights disappearing up the ramp toward street level. Only then did she allow herself to relax slightly, the adrenaline beginning to fade from her system. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes from start to finish, but it felt like a lifetime. She retrieved her car keys from where they had fallen during the brief fight and finished loading her groceries. Her hands were steady, showing no trace of the violence that had just occurred. This was simply another problem that had been identified, assessed, and resolved using appropriate force. As Sarah drove out of the parking garage, she reflected on the irony of the situation. She had survived multiple combat deployments, faced enemy fire in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and had finally returned home to civilian life. Yet it was in a suburban shopping center that she had encountered her first real threat since leaving the military. The three men had made a critical error in their target selection. They had seen what they thought was an easy victim and had acted accordingly. What they had actually encountered was a highly trained professional who had spent years preparing for exactly this type of situation. Their assumption had cost them dearly, and the lesson would likely stay with them for the rest of their lives. Sarah drove through the quiet streets toward her apartment. The normalcy of suburban evening traffic, a stark contrast to the violence that had just unfolded in the parking garage. Streetlights illuminated peaceful neighborhoods where families were settling in for the night, completely unaware that a former Navy SEAL had just defended herself against armed attackers less than a mile away. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister asking about dinner plans for the weekend. The mundane nature of the message highlighted the strange duality of Sarah's existence. To her family and friends, she was simply adjusting to civilian life after military service. They knew she had been deployed overseas but had little understanding of what that actually meant or what skills she had developed during her time in the Navy. When Sarah reached her apartment complex, she sat in her car for several minutes before going inside. The encounter in the parking garage had triggered a flood of memories from her military service, not because of the violence itself, which had been relatively minor compared to combat operations, but because of the familiar feeling of being underestimated by people who had no idea what they were facing. During her first deployment, Sarah had encountered similar attitudes from both allies and enemies, who couldn't reconcile her appearance with her capabilities. She had learned to use those assumptions as tactical advantages, allowing opponents to underestimate her right up until the moment their misconceptions cost them dearly. Inside her apartment, Sarah unpacked her groceries with methodical precision. The routine task helped ground her in the present moment, pushing away the adrenaline after effects and the unwanted memories of more serious conflicts. She had worked hard to build this peaceful civilian life, and she wasn't going to let 3 amateur criminals disrupt the progress she had made. Her phone rang as she was putting away the last items. The caller ID showed Detective Martinez, her older brother who worked for the city police department. For a moment, Sarah wondered if news of the parking garage incident had somehow reached him, but she quickly dismissed the idea. The attackers certainly weren't going to report their failed robbery, and security footage would only be reviewed if someone filed a complaint. "Hey, Marcus," she answered, keeping her voice casual. "Just checking in on my favorite sister." Her brother replied warmly. "How's the civilian adjustment going?" "Still weird not being able to tell people what you really did in the Navy." Sarah smiled despite herself. Marcus was one of the few family members who had some understanding of her military service, though even he didn't know the full extent of her training or combat experience. The nature of SEAL operations meant that many details would remain classified indefinitely. "Getting easier," she said honestly, "though I had an interesting reminder tonight about why situational awareness is still important." "Everything okay? You sound different." Sarah considered how much to share. Her brother was a good detective and would pick up on any inconsistencies if she tried to deflect completely. But she also didn't want to worry him unnecessarily or trigger a police investigation that would complicate her efforts to maintain a low profile. Just some guys in a parking garage who thought they picked an easy target, she said finally. They were wrong. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sarah, please tell me you didn't hurt anyone. Define hurt, Sarah replied with dark humor. One of them is probably explaining to an emergency room doctor how he broke his nose walking into a door. The other two learned some valuable lessons about making assumptions. Thank you for watching, Marcus groaned. I don't suppose you'd be willing to file a report? Attempted robbery is a serious crime, especially if weapons were involved. No weapons worth mentioning, Sarah lied smoothly. The switchblade had been more of an intimidation tool than a serious threat, and mentioning it would only complicate the conversation. And no, I'm not interested in filing reports or answering questions about my response to the situation. Some problems are better handled quietly. Her brother understood the implication. As a police detective, he dealt regularly with situations where official responses created more problems than they solved. Sometimes justice was better served by allowing natural consequences to teach their own lessons. Just promise me you're being careful, Marcus said. I know you can handle yourself. But civilian life has different rules than military operations. Not every problem can be solved with force. I'm always careful, Sarah assured him. And I only use as much force as necessary. Tonight's situation required very little. Fortunately for everyone involved. After ending the call, Sarah made herself a simple dinner and tried to settle into her evening routine. But her mind kept returning to the parking garage encounter, analyzing it from different angles and drawing connections to her military experience. The three attackers had made several critical errors beyond simply choosing the wrong target. Their positioning had been sloppy, their coordination poor, and their escalation to weapons unnecessary and premature. Most importantly, they had failed to gather adequate intelligence about their intended victim before making their move. In military terms, they had launched an operation without proper reconnaissance, using inferior tactics against an unknown opponent. The predictable result was a swift and decisive defeat that left them worse off than when they started. It was a textbook example of how assumptions and poor planning could turn a seemingly advantageous situation into a complete disaster. Sarah wondered what the three men would tell their friends and family about their injuries and failure. Would they admit to attempting robbery and getting overwhelmed by a woman half their size? Or would they create some alternative story that preserved their dignity while hiding their criminal intentions? More importantly, would the experience deter them from future robbery attempts? Or would they simply choose more carefully in the future? Sarah hoped for the former, but suspected the latter. People who turned to crime rarely learned lasting lessons from single negative experiences, especially when those experiences could be rationalized as bad luck rather than fundamental character flaws. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the broader implications of the evening's events. Her military service had given her capabilities that most civilians couldn't imagine, but it had also given her responsibilities that extended beyond her own safety. She had the power to stop criminals and protect innocent people, but she also had to consider the consequences of using that power in civilian contexts. The parking garage encounter had ended with minimal violence and no lasting damage to anyone involved. But what would happen the next time she witnessed criminal activity? What if the stakes were higher, or the criminals more dangerous, or innocent bystanders were at risk? Sarah knew that her training and instincts would compel her to act, but she also knew that civilian justice systems weren't designed to accommodate the kind of direct action that military operations sometimes required. Before falling asleep, Sarah made a mental note to research local volunteer opportunities with police departments or community safety organizations. If she was going to continue living in civilian society, she needed to find constructive outlets for her skills and training. The alternative was a series of parking garage encounters that would eventually attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or criminal organizations looking for revenge. Her last thought before drifting off was about the three attackers, probably sitting in an emergency room somewhere, trying to explain their injuries. She genuinely hoped they would use the experience as an opportunity for reflection and change, but she wasn't optimistic. In her experience, people rarely learned from consequences they could rationalize away. What mattered more was that they had learned to fear the consequences of their actions, even if they didn't understand the lessons. Sometimes fear was more effective than understanding when it came to modifying dangerous behavior. And if nothing else, they would think twice before approaching lone women in parking garages, which would make the world a slightly safer place for everyone else.